Salvete legionaries, I have come from a distant time, over in the future, because we are transporting the future to the now. Through the power of Techn and speed, I have brought a special guest today. What do you go by? Do you go by leader, chairman of the National Futurist Party? What's your official title?
I'm the head.
Head, okay, we'll
The
go with head.
head of the National Futurist Party.
Well, yeah, it was too politically incorrect to call you the Duce, right, of the Italian Futurist Party.
You could call me the Duchess.
There we go, the Duce.
The Duce.
Is it Duchese? I don't know how to say it. I'm not. My Italian is a little
Ducina.
poor.
Ducina.
Yeah, we'll think of something cool. But anyway, the head of the National Futurist Party, Rachel Haywire. Would you just care to introduce yourself to the legionaries and just give a brief introduction before we go into the party itself and then some of your other super cool projects that are in the wings?
Yeah, so my name is Rachel Haywire. I am a art philosopher, cultural theorist, founder of a gallery called Fiume. I run the Cultural Futurist Substack, and I'm the author of New Art Right. I'm very focused on how culture and the future intersect with each other and the hyperdimension of politics.
Yeah, and then going into the National Futurist Party itself, if you could just briefly tell the legionaries, of course, many of the legionaries like to consider themselves futurist. Of course, the legionaries want to bring a Roman future about, a new Roman Empire. So maybe it's a little bit different. But for the legionaries who aren't as familiar, if you could just briefly introduce the party itself.
My fellow legionnaires, it is time for a new futurist uprising. We have been coddled, and the bureaucracy has stomped out the true innovation of thought. But we're coming back. We're not elitist. We're not populist. We're something else. We're futurists. We're national futurists. We believe in the future of our nation. We believe in greatness. We believe in beauty. We believe in American technology. And our focus is on creating a future that is free from foreign influence, that is also very high tech and high acceleration, ultra escape velocity. And we want to do this and throw parties. So it's kind of a pun. We're a party, but we're actually just a political organization. We're not an official political party. But we also throw parties because I'm the founder of a gallery called Fume. And we had a pre-party for the Fiume gallery, and we called it the National Futurist Party. So it's kind of a play on words. We're
Gotcha.
national futurists, and we throw parties. And those are a few of my opinions.
And for the legionaries who have not done their homework and aren't familiar with the importance of the name Fiume, I just want to briefly educate them. Legionaries, if you haven't familiarized yourself with Gabriele D'Annunzio, then you're wrong, and you haven't been keeping up with Project Mayhem's homework. Of course, there is no Project Mayhem. But the Fiume was essentially this breakaway state after World War I in Croatia, but it was composed of many Italians, and Gabriele D'Annunzio formed this unit of Arditi. Of course, the Arditi were once shock troops of Italy, but of course he appropriates the name for this new shock troop, an ideological, artistic shock troop, and individuals such as Marinetti joined him in the Fiume, and it was essentially this fascistic, anarchistic breakaway state of Italians in Croatia that existed for, I believe, 1 to 2 years until they were forced to stand down by Italy itself. But it represented a cultural, artistic project of something that really hadn't existed before. It was a mix of these antiquarian, classical, and futurist elements. Of course, D'Annunzio and Marinetti have a little bit of a clash. Maybe we can talk about that at some point. But the reason why Rachel's art gallery, I think, has very high thumos aesthetic is because the Fiume represents a sort of intellectual revolt, a sort of philosophical revolt. So I like that you use that name. And then maybe if you could tell the legionaries a little bit about the gallery itself and maybe some of the exciting things that are planned currently.
Sure. So legionnaires, Fiume is a liminal space. It is an art gallery that was definitely inspired by the D'Annunzio network state that existed for a year in Italy, where all these poets and artists and writers got together and formed their own microstate. And at the time, it was what I believe an art project. It wasn't militant until later on. And I think that being somewhere in the middle is where the excitement lies. Being a militant philosopher, being a hardcore poet, being an extremist artist. So I'm thinking, okay, what if we freeze Fiume in time, turn it into a liminal space, and kind of reincarnate it as a gallery in the arts district of New York City, which is Chelsea. Chelsea is
Mhm.
where all the luxury art galleries are. And I decided that we needed our own space in the luxury art district of New York. And I figured, okay, I'm going to call it Fiume. The people who get it, they're going to understand the concept. They're going to understand the creative, surreal aspect behind it. And the people who don't get the reference, they're still going to be attracted to the art. The name is fancy to them.
Yeah.
Fiume. Are you going to Fiume? So, it kind of works both ways. Like, I guess it's a little Straussian, though I hate to use that term. Um, but yeah, basically getting creative people together that are on the vanguard of intellectual thought, post-political theorists, people that are on the right but that maybe don't agree with everything that's happening on the right, you know, creative intellectual warrior types and artists, musicians, poets, bringing everybody together and kind of putting them in a new alchemical mix and having a good time. We're doing an opening on the 10th of May, and I'm really excited about that. We have artists like Giovanni Panichetti, Skinless Frank, Alexander Adams. We're doing a dark burlesque show, kind of like a militant cabaret event. We're calling it the Dictator Pageant. We have girls that are dressed up, goth, fetish aesthetic, that are going to be giving historical speeches. And I don't want to give away too much, but it's going to be wild. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's definitely fascistic, but like in a fun, creative, artistic way. So there is
Sure.
no killing. There are like no black shirts. You can come and like dress up as one if you want to, as long as the outfit looks good. But we just want to have a good time, get people out there that want to have good conversations. I'm also appeal to artists in the mainstream world that are sick of the monolithic culture that exists within the art world as it is. They want something new, something edgy, something a little bit outside of what they're used to. They want to freely express themselves. They feel like they can't. So Fiume is actually a place where people can be free and express themselves. Just like the original Italian state. That's what Fiume originally was too.
Yeah, and there's that famous image that people talk about. I don't know if it's a real image or not because I haven't seen it, but there's that image they conjure up of that guy, that naked guy on a motorcycle with like a
Yeah.
falcon on his shoulder or something. That's what the
Yeah.
Fiume represents to me. It's this crazy sort of new artistic blend, but also with that militancy. It's this guy, very austere, very strong thumos, and he has a falcon on his shoulder. Like there's nothing more badass than that. Something out of Mongolia or something. But really quick, you said no black shirts. So what you're saying is I can't dress up as a Talo Balbo and show
No,
up
you
to this thing?
can. You're welcome to do that. What I mean is that we're not killing anybody.
Gotcha.
I
We're not
just
breaking
want to
up
put
any
that
labor
out.
unions.
No, you can like dress up like Mosley if you want.
Oh, okay. You have to admit, he
The
had
more
drip.
the
He had drip.
merrier. He was like one of the original mods. Like
Really?
the mods in the UK.
Yeah.
Like I feel like Mosley was the first mod. Kind of like in the lineage of Jonathan Bowden. Like he was kind of a mod too.
Really?
So Mosley was kind of a mod,
Hmm.
because he was like a hip, in style, icon. So of course you can dress up like a black shirt, but I want to make it clear that we're not killing anybody. I guess I'm still, after all these years, worried about OPSEC. But yeah, we're just having a good time. We're just creatives that are hanging out together. But the crazier you dress, the better. Just come have fun, check out the art, come see the bands play, get to know people, network, collaborate.
Yeah, and there's a few things I wanted to talk about from there. You in the new art right, which is of course a clever title. Of course, the alt right had its big blow up shortly before your book, and I think the message I got from it is a sort of a reclaiming of that energy because people were really down after the alt right. They felt that the dissident right was done. Of course, people like BAP and Curtis Yarvin talk about how the activism failed. Right, left thrived on activism, but for the right with the institutions against them, it was impossible. So there was a lot of blackpilling, and I like this new art right. It's sort of reclaiming that original energy, but with a new flair. And one of the things I thought was interesting is you talk about how the new dissident right-wing individual is almost a hipster because all these things that were considered fringe before are mainstream. So it's not cool anymore. So it's like once you get to a certain point, the only thing that's cool is that which is socially unacceptable. So you almost see this hipster fascist emerge. And I don't know if are you familiar with Casa Pound by any chance?
Of course.
Yeah. So Casa Pound, that's what I was thinking when you were writing about these things, because it's these young dudes with earrings and they're feeding the homeless and they're dressed nicely. And I think that's why the Italians are so interesting compared to the sort of Anglophonic cultures, that they have this avant-garde artistic expression, which of course you're really big on. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about when you were talking about in the New Art Right about this sort of shift, it reminded me of Mussolini originally being a socialist, for instance, right, and then becoming a fascist. One of the fun fact for everybody, I was talking to Dr. Jason Giorgiani last week, and he mentioned one of the reasons Mussolini became fascist was because of his Jewish mistress, who actually, introduced him to a lot of these ideas, and she's famous for saying. Yeah, maybe you can touch up on that. It seems like you're.
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely you want to put Marinetti in between D'Annunzio and Mussolini. I don't think you can go straight from D'Annunzio to Mussolini
Right.
without taking Marinetti's militant actions very seriously, looking at him as a strategist, as a Machiavellian, as a poet and an artist himself who wanted to get in with the Italian government and negotiated with Mussolini to do so. So, some people, they see him kind of like an Ezra Pound figure, but other people, they see him, as an evil fascist. For example, they're like, "Whoa, Marinetti, that's too much." I love the guy. I love the Futurist Manifesto. I think it inspired an entire generation. It actually inspired generations to come. I think even the effective accelerationists now are inspired by Marinetti's work. I mean, even Mark Andreessen quoted Marinetti in the Techno-Optimist
I didn't know
Manifesto.
that.
So yeah, he actually did. He was very subtle about it. He's like referencing another futurism from long ago, and then he just dropped the Marinetti quote. Yeah, so the Jewish mistress question, I mean, yeah, she did have a big influence on Mussolini, but I think that it was the socialist infighting that he experienced that really made him a vanguardist. I think he believed in the principles of socialism until he found out what it actually was about firsthand. He was right in the middle of it. And that propelled him into founding fascism. And I feel like Marinetti was kind of his muse in a lot of these periods. But I think D'Annunzio is kind of Marinetti's muse. So I definitely think there's a pathway from D'Annunzio to Marinetti to Mussolini. There's a chain.
Yeah, and of course, Marinetti writes the first fascist manifesto in 1921, even before Gentile and Mussolini wrote their own maybe a decade
Yeah,
later or so.
the Futurist Manifesto, and then it became the Fascist Manifesto. And a lot of the Futurists, they were not fascist. And a lot of the fascists were not futurist. A lot of
Right.
people don't understand that. Some people, they think, okay, well, fascists created futurism. No, futurists created fascism. It's the other way around.
Right.
And a lot of futurists, they didn't like fascism. And a lot of them, they went really hard on it, designed incredible art for it. A lot of them didn't want to be a part of the fascist government. So you had a lot of futurists that had a lot of different political opinions.
Yeah, and going off of that, you mentioned D'Annunzio and Marinetti's relationship, which I found interesting because it was very volatile. Of course, Marinetti sees D'Annunzio as too much of a classicist, right? And of course, Marinetti wants to tear down the statues, tear down the museums, and rebuild. He wanted to get rid of pasta. This is true, by the way, everybody.
Oh,
Legionaries.
yeah.
Marinetti wanted to get rid of Italian pasta and replace it with Italian rice.
Make his own cuisine, make
Yeah,
his
he was
own cookbook. Yeah.
right. The Futurist cookbook, so weird. I've heard the recipes taste terrible, but you have to be
It's
willing.
funny. It's
It's
kitschy. A lot of
yeah,
the food is kitschy. It's just like it's a weird homage.
it's a good Christmas gift. No, get somebody the
I
Futurist cookbook.
I actually did that once
Really,
for Hanukkah. Yeah.
that's a good gift. But on the topic of going back to the new art, right? I had some things that I wanted to ask you specifically about that, and one of the things you mentioned, which I thought was interesting, is going back to, again, we're talking about this sort of fringe that emerges from who originally would probably have been considered leftists. And you talk a lot about countercultures. You talked about the beatniks, the mods, etc. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was the role that countercultures play in influencing the elite, because it's one thing to have a counterculture, obviously, but then it's another thing to be like Marinetti and actually have Mussolini's ear for a long time. And I wanted to sort of delve into perhaps your mission as well with the National Futurist Party and the role that countercultures can play, not only to be countercultures, but how to actually develop that hard power by influencing somebody like Trump, who may not be as artistic, but obviously is necessary to push the agenda.
Well, I have a Spenglerian theory of subcultures. They constantly rotate, but the underlying themes remain the same. So you might have gothic, you might have punk, you might have mod, you might have beatnik. They start out as these avant-garde movements with a few weird intellectuals just hanging out, and eventually they write books, they start music projects, they have their own style, their own way of expressing themselves, and they begin penetrating the mainstream. Because what happens is that they have audacity to go out there and behave like this. They're seen as theatrical in the beginning. People don't take them seriously. But advertising companies, they catch on and they're like, oh, that's what all the kids are into now. So we're going to market it to the public, right? And then the public takes an interest in it. And now the public is becoming mod and they're becoming beatnik, they're becoming goth. Now you have goth clubs, right? You have beatniks like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac with published books that are popular American mainstream classics. And eventually the mainstream, it adapts the counterculture and just becomes the new version of it. A lot of the original people and the founding of the subculture, they get away from it at this point and they say, I don't want to be a part of it. Everything has changed. This isn't what I envisioned. That it becomes essentially the new power. Not everything is taken in, of course. Like, for example, like we don't have anybody who is dressed very goth in our administration, but we did have Elon Musk wearing Make America Goth Again hat, I believe, and it kind of like had a metal font on it. So he was sort of doing a tribute
Yeah, dark
to,
MAGA.
yeah, the Dark Maga thing. He was kind of like doing a tribute to people into goth, industrial, metal. He wanted to hit that demographic. Even like Vans, with all the Vans memes and, the eyes. It's the cultures, they move, but the structure remains the same. The structure is just people starting something that gets popular, that gets adapted by the public, that then gets adapted by the state, that then becomes the new power, and the founders often completely detached from it. And I think that happens with every subculture. It happens with every art movement, including Futurism, of course. It happens with every political movement. It's just a Spenglerian subculture cycle, and it keeps going. It's eternal recurrence. It's the never-ending subcultural development of nations and empires.
And going into that, I think something we've talked about before as well in one of your spaces was the lack of attention and care provided for culture and the arts by the current right. And perhaps that's turned off many more intellectual or futurist minded people from the definition of the right. The current right, the Steve Bannon types, has this antiquarian view of history. They're all traditionalist conservatives. They all want to go back, right? We're living in the Kali Yuga. So a lot of people with this progressive, quote unquote, not progressive in the leftist sense, but progressive in a futurist sense, are very turned off to the definition of the right. And I think it goes back largely to what Nietzsche has to say about the Englishman, the Anglo, and even his own, the German culture of his time, not the original German culture. And
Yeah.
of course, he says, he criticizes Anglophonic culture as very rigid, very stoic. And there's definitely something to be said about the right needing to return to art and patronage, right? We need patronage for the arts. The
Yeah.
right needs to care for art, and that's kind of what your project is largely about. So maybe you can delve into the specific things you're doing as part of fueling and furnishing a counterculture that is largely in response to this stagnant leftist art that has pervaded American society for what, like 50 years?
Yeah. I mean, I would say even longer. I mean, you think of the Medicis in Italy and how they funded the Sistine Chapel, and you've got to wonder, why haven't we had anything grandiose like that? Why has everything flattened and become this horizontalist structure of essentially, I would call it spiritual communism, right? Everything is flat. There is no hierarchy. There is no uplifting. It's an inside joke of an inside joke of an inside joke. You've got a banana nailed to a wall, and you're trying to figure out the joke about the joke about the joke. It's derivative. It's postmodern. It's not even creative about the postmodernism that it's doing. It's just like lowest common denominator. Look at me. I can make something that is completely dull and boring, but hey, people are in on the joke, so they'll buy it. So the morale of the art world, it definitely lost a lot of its vitalist power. It lost a lot of its hardcore intensity. And my project with the new art right is to bring back that intensity, to bring back the vitalism of art that has been removed by the institutions that have sanitized and cleansed it in a way that the spirit from it is gone. So we're resurrecting the spirit of art, and that's what I call the art right. And I call it the new art right because, we're a new faction and we're kind of like emerging out of the alt right, but we're not alt right, we're not Philistines. We're like this secret third thing. I felt like a lot of people like on the traditional right didn't understand it. And of course, people on the left freak out. So I think there was a need to create this new political position, maybe similar to what people did throughout history, to explain the stance of, I guess, like being a nationalist, but also being an intellectual, being an artist, but also being into the more extreme views. I think that there really wasn't a space for that before. People felt very lonely, intellectually isolated. They knew there were others like them, but when they went online, they just found a bunch of slop and coal, with the same memes over and over again. So one of the reasons that I started the National Futurist Party was just to bring like-minded people together. It started out as a Twitter space. It was just a way for people to talk. I wanted to talk to people who I could relate to. So I just started hosting spaces and brought a few of my friends on. Athenian Stranger hosted one with me. So just, bringing people together that shared ideas, that wanted to talk about things on a higher level without having to worry about like lowering, our discourse to be understandable to everybody. Yeah, when I say we're not populist, we're not elitist, we're national futurists, this is what I'm talking about. Like, we might be elitist, but we're not elite, right? We're a new elite, but we're not the elite. We're a counter elite. But we're not populist just because we're MAGA. We're a faction of MAGA. If anything, we're factionalists.
Yeah, when I brought up Bannon, for instance, right, that represents the sort of trad side of MAGA. And I think it's unfortunate that Musk is the closest appropriation we have to a futurist element
I don't
in
like that.
MAGA.
Yeah, when they were comparing Musk to Marinetti, I felt like it was still in valor.
Yeah,
I don't think that he really understands futurism except
no,
like
I
in the
agree. Yeah.
modern sense of tech futurism. I think if he was to read the Futurist Manifesto, it would just be like weird art faggy stuff to him. But you know what? Like it is art faggy, and people they deride it because it talks about like violence against women, for example. But I mean, obviously he wasn't talking about all women. And I think he was using women as an adjective just to describe the weak and the docile, people who lacked the vitalist fire, that like really brought out that energetic current. I think like when an energetic current is suppressed, then it creates this level of repression that boils up to the surface
Mm.
and it eventually explodes. And often that is how you get great empires. And it's controversial, but that's often how the greatest empires arise.
Sure, or even in the case of the legendary founding of Rome, it's all these vagabonds and outcasts who have nothing, right? They have no possessions, they don't have families, so what do? They go out and claim it. They're essentially these incels, but they worked out
Right.
and stuff, and they were actually instead of just hiding in their rooms in their basements, they were like, all right, this sucks. We're gonna go out and do something about it. They weren't black pillars, they're the ultimate white pillars, but
Yeah.
going into perhaps some of the first principles of your positions, I wanted to go into speed and Techn. We were talking earlier, I was mentioning Giorgiani's position on speed and Techn as taking ontological priority to time. And you mentioned that you had a different, similar but different position or assertion there. So I kind of wanted to explore your specific views of the power of Techn as a creative force, and then maybe the other implications, whether that's the colloquial, metaphysical, spiritual, whatever. Let's just delve into it and see sort of what comes out of that.
Yeah, so I mean, Giorgiani, the way that he looks at speed and tacting, he's very occultist about it in a way where he wants to hide it and kind of like reinvoke it. Where I think we can reinvoke it without hiding it. I don't think it needs to be occulted. I don't think it needs to be like within that occult realm. You can have a secret realm that is an event or a party. I just hosted a salon called Art Imperium. It was a secret realm. We didn't have to go into occultism for that. I don't think that tracing everything to the occult is a good way to really understand metaphysics, let alone speed or techne. So I think that speed needs to be isolated as a separate phenomena. It's an animist phenomena that comes out on its own. It is outside of time. Speed exists on its own plane. Speed will go, speed will continue, speed will always be on its own metaphysical plane. And you don't need occultism to figure that out. You just need to understand physics.
So of course I have to back up my boy Dr. Giorgiani. I think the sort of position that he has in regards to Techne and speed, uh, obviously it largely taken from Heidegger, right? The idea of Gestel, and seeing technology as a means of unveiling reality. And I agree with him a lot with his positions regarding episteme sort of being replaced by scientia, this science that is largely constrained. You talk about you mentioned physics, for instance, and I think a lot of that obviously is constrained within our own understanding. And I agree with Heidegger in the sense that technology and techne is a unveiling of reality. And of course, Heidegger has his fears and whatever, which I don't necessarily agree with. But I do see techne as this unveiling, right, of reality and
I
expanding our
mean,
understanding of reality.
I
Maybe yes or no.
yes and no. So Heidegger was a bit of a mystic as much as Heideggerians like to deny that. And he saw technology as this great other. Kind of like how leftists see capitalism. He didn't really grasp its inner core. He just saw it as a symbolic representation of automation. And it's a good way to map things, but the map is not the territory. So I don't think that he really delved into it in a way that would be considered technical. He applied his philosophical positions to explain a phenomena that he was mystified by.
Yeah, and going to the creative force of techne, because I think what's more interesting than necessarily the ontology of techne is what we can do with it, right? Like techne is a creative force.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe we can delve into that a little bit. And I just wanted to offer maybe some of my own thoughts and we can kind of bounce them back. The way I see Techne is ultimately it boils everything down to what you do with creative forces. And then I think it goes back to sort of Nietzschean psychology and, well, what are you trying to do with this creative force? That's the more interesting question is what are we
Exactly,
going to do with
exactly.
it and what motivates, right? So maybe we can go into that. And I'll just say really quickly, I think ultimately, and of course you bring this up in your last essay. Let me read off the title for Legionaries. It was the New American Aesthetic, right? I'm pulling it up right now. I think that was the
The aesthetic rebirth of America. The aesthetic rebirth
that's
of
right, Aesthetic
America.
Rebirth of America. Indeed. And part of that obviously is a return to this desire to create what is beautiful. I saw this X post today, and it was this giant door which had no functional utility. It was a huge door, maybe 100 feet high, and people were saying, "Why do we need a door this big?" And you don't need a good reason. It looks freaking cool. It's this beautiful work. And,
Yeah,
and back in, especially during the Renaissance and later on during Spengler's time as well, Spengler talked about the elites. I mean, they almost went too far where they were just focused on these cultural projects. And of course, they stopped focusing on the utility of techne or technics. But
yeah,
there's
yeah.
this lost art of these monumental monolithic structures that people just don't care about because we don't have beauty as our first principle. So maybe we can bounce ideas off of beauty as a first principle and techne as a creative force.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're intertwined in a way that is very complementary. I think Vita and Techne revolve around each other. I think that some of the greatest art galleries that you go to, even now, you can still go to the Norman Simon Museum in LA. You can see classical Italian art from the Renaissance period. It's still there, and you've got the social functionaries who build the institutions and they kind of carry it with them, and use the tools that they have available to them to build new institutions. And you've got all these exhibits. In New York, there actually was Italian futurist exhibit. This was like 5 years ago. So I think a lot of ideas they kind of travel. I think, like the way that you see all these European statues, like in the community, I think that has translated into a desire to create real statues. You see now AI companies that can make statues for individual customers. So you can actually have a customized statue built now through artificial intelligence. So it all kind of revolves around each other. It influences itself.
Yeah. So I'm gonna create an AI Arno Brecker, and he's gonna
You
create
can.
the Aryan Superman for me in person. That's pretty cool.
If you
Um,
want to, you can now. And I think, that this was the market. And
yeah.
I think what you would call the new tech right kind of picked up on it
Hmm.
and they went for it.
Yeah, and maybe we could talk a little bit specifically. Obviously, I don't want to delve too much into your next art show because I don't want to spoil anything. But if there's anything specific, because when I notice the works that I've seen advertised thus far, we were mentioning the militancy that's sort of required in art, and of course, D'Annunzio glorifies violence, speed and violence. And I was reading a collective, like a little collected works of his, had the Futurist Manifesto, lots of his speeches. I did a video with Lance's Legion on it called "The Beauty of Violence," and there
Mhm.
is this militant quality that's inserted into it. The artist warrior, guys like Junger, guys like Mishima. And I
Yeah.
notice a lot of the artwork in the Fume are militant. You have, I believe, there's a few where it's like you have these Greek statues, but you also have these modern soldiers. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that and maybe the inspirations of why you're a patron for that specific kind of art.
Well, I mean, I think that art and militancy go hand in hand. I think the best art is militant. I think it always will be. There's a militant force that awakens people and that brings you to the realm of what I would call true art. I love Skinless Frank as an artist, and his art was very militant. I had seen it around. We followed each other on Instagram, and I just DM'd him out of the blue. And I said, "Do you want to be a part of my new art gallery? It's called Fume." And he got it, and the rest is history. So I think you can't really have good art if you don't have uh not I don't want to say you can't have good art if you don't have militancy, but I think you can't have a good art gallery if there isn't some militancy involved. Going back to the Norman Simon Museum, like all of the paintings of war, for example, the slaughter, you know, the desecration. I think that kind of brings forth a new element of beauty that kind of like rises out of the ashes, like the phoenix or like Rome being rebuilt, which is the basis of art. Like creating a new Rome is the basis of all artistic expression.
Yes.
And yeah, it all comes from that impulse. And anybody who tried to get rid of that impulse, they were not met historically in a way that they liked. And that should be a lesson for them.
Yeah, and there's never been a great artistic people without that martial element. I mean, look at the Greeks, right? They had a real military culture. Uh, or if we go to the modern era, you can't have great art without a great military because art is in large part an armor of beauty, which is an armor of violence, right? It's all sort of tied together, like we discussed. And even people, even communists who in which case hierarchy and beauty supposedly don't matter. You look at the Soviets and they have statues of the Soviet Superman, which is completely
I mean,
fascistic.
some of the communist propaganda actually looks more hardcore than some of the modern gallery art that you see today. I really just, I mean, even the hammer and the sickle, as horrible as that symbol is, there was still a hammer. The hammer was
Yeah.
still there, philosophizing with a hammer. So it was still more Nietzschean than the majority of icons that come out today. I think that fascism became taboo because of an energetic current that people thought caused too much volatility. A lot of it was just data science. A lot of it came down to like these elements are too volatile. people don't know how to really handle this level of intensity. And the truth is that most people don't. Which is why I think Fiume was formed essentially, was the people who did know how to handle the energy, could kind of just do their own thing and not have to worry about the people outside of Fiume who didn't really understand what they were about. Obviously, that's a conceptual inspiration for my gallery. I think, not, it might not be for everybody, I think people are going to try to ban and demonize things that terrify them,
Hmm.
but they might not understand historical context. They might just see something as like the big bad wolf,
Right.
like Hitler or Trump. They become these Girardian scapegoats.
Right.
So they kind of did something similar to fascism, and they don't understand the difference between fascism and Nazism, which is another weird thing. Like these are two different political theories. Like, why
Oh,
are you
absolutely.
conflating them? So I don't know. Like most people, they don't know that you could have been a fascist intellectual. There was even a book about it. It was called Mussolini's Intellectuals. But most people, they'd like, oh well, you can't be that if you're that. You can't do that if you're that. It's like calling somebody an Uncle Tom in a way.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. And essentially, one thing I was talking about with the Giorgiani was, of course, this esoteric reading of Plato. So I think, I consider myself a Nietzschean, but I think there's a lot to be learned
Same.
from Plato. And of
Yeah.
course, the Platonic, most people are stuck in the matrix, the Plato's cave, and they have the light is these fiery ideas, these scary ideas, these militant ideas, and of course we're going to reach a point where, I mean, in the book you talk about the 1% versus the 99%. uh, you're always going to receive, initially as a counterculture, you're always going to receive pushback from the 99%. That's very easy to manipulate them, right? So
Not
ultimately,
all the time. Because what happens is that, well, there's a split between the philosopher kings where there are some people that are just like a little bit too extreme, you know, um, for the guardians, and they become like the dark guardians. They go off and start their own thing, and then they get killed by the barbarians. I call it the Night of the Silver Spoons. It's what happens
oh,
before the Night
yeah.
of the Long Knives in every national fairy tale. So you have this period, where the guardians have an invite, and then they kick out like the most fringe intellectuals out of their ivory towers, and then they're like kind of forced to like organize their own females. So I really I see it in a Nietzschean way. It's the eternal recurrence of these different formations, but the underlying, it's always going to have the same structural element. It's very Nietzschean. It's very Spenglerian. I don't think that will ever change. I think this is just how people behave, and it's just how history rotates. I think history is animated.
Well, let's talk about that really quick, the Night of the Silver Spoons, because when you were talking about the fallen aristocrat, I couldn't help thinking of On the Marble Cliffs. And of course, you talk about being pushed off of the plastic cliff. So I think I read into that. That must have been a little,
Wanna-
yeah, a little Easter egg. But you talked about the fallen aristocrat, and of course, I couldn't help remembering at the end of near the end of the On the Marble Cliffs, they have that big battle, and there's that old aristocrat. He's skinny. He's got eye bags from being awake all the time, and of course, he goes into the woods to go fight against the head forester, which is sort of this analogy of the old aristocracy and the populist Nazi Germans. Um, and Ernst Jünger, I think, suffered from the Night of the Silver Spoons,
Oh
and lots of
yeah. Oh yeah.
intellectuals. And one of the differences between Nazi Germany and fascist Italy is that the Italians didn't really have a Night of the Silver Spoons. Marinetti still had, even though he had a lot
Well,
less
they
influence.
kind of did. I mean, Fume
In
only lasted for a year. A lot of the poets, they were definitely considered too weird for the Italian Fascist Party. But there wasn't like a brutal killing
right.
of that level. But like at the same time, like who knows what really happened? That's why I like to look at things more in the context of conceptual frameworks of historical phenomena rather than, okay, like this person got killed by that person and that movement. But if we look at it conceptually, like, yeah, the intellectuals are usually kicked out of the parties that they found. Philosophers of Power is the name that I use for it.
Mm.
The 1% of philosophers that kind of write the doctrines of empire. How many of these philosophers go on to be a part of the rising empire? Sometimes it's like 20%, sometimes it's 80%. You've got people like Heidegger that were in good standing with the Nazi Party, but eventually even he had to go. You had people like Jünger who got away from it from the beginning, became anarchs and completely tapped out of anything and everything related to Hitler. D'Annunzio, I don't believe he was a very big Mussolini fan.
Yeah, he
So,
wasn't. He
there are
died
different,
pretty
yeah.
early.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's an unfortunate facet of history that it's often the founders of the empires that become casualties of them. I
Mm.
don't think we should ignore that. It is a bit of a black pill that I think we need to reckon with it. We can learn from the mistakes of our ancestors.
Yeah, I mean that is true, especially of that period. In Romania, Codriano was executed in prison. Jose Primo Rivera was executed, and then of course El Cadillo, Francisco Franco took over. So, yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
absolutely
Ezra Pound, and it continues. So I think that maybe to be in good standing with the new political power and to remain an artist or an intellectual, you need a new framework to apply. And the question is, like, can we get out of this Spenglerian Nietzschean eternal recurrence that constantly has these patterns, right? Like, can you stop the Night of the Silver Spoons? I got into this. Sorry if this is like too weird and out there. I actually I don't know who your audience is, so I have a feeling I can be a little bit more open with them.
sure.
Sometimes I have to dumb myself down a bit. Um, can you stop the Night of the Silver Spoons? Like, is that possible? Can you stop the founders of these empires from becoming casualties of them? And I think you can. I want to be white pilled about this. I just think that you need to go about it in a very meticulous way. You need to have good gatekeeping. You need to have good ambassadorship. You need to iterate. You need to keep testing. Like you need to see it like a state, and you need to understand the mistakes that you've made in the past as an empire, and correct them.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, most of the time, the intellectual backing of a state or regime is not actually the leading class. And of course, it sort of is reminiscent of the old aristocracy. The priestly class obviously makes up the spiritual center, but the warrior class has the actual power, I guess. It's complicated, but it all goes back, I think, in large part. You go back to what Plato attempted to do, right? The noble lie, in a sense, is what's going to be palatable for leaders to apply to their subjects. And in some part, I think people overplay, for example, Aristotle's influence on Alexander the Great. Like, it wasn't that big. It's a better story
Yeah.
than it is reality. But there is still something to
Yeah.
be said of a intellectual elite furnishing the Machiavellian sovereign, right? The person with actual power, because you have
Oh,
to
yeah.
you have
I
to
mean,
be in their ear.
yeah. Okay. So I think Carl Schmitt was really good at defining this. And I think that he stayed in good standing for a while for this reason.
Yeah.
I think, figures like Nietzsche and Jünger, who were essentially radical free thinkers, who just stood on their own, who really created their own philosophy. They weren't, pre-existing categories. They started their own categories. Vitalism emerged from Nietzsche, just like the anarch emerged from Jünger. They were these loner figures that inspired, I guess, the legions of loners that came after them. If you want to get really Machiavellian, they wrote for the many who thought that they were the few. That was their purpose.
Mm.
You could say the same about Plato. The many. who thought they were the few. You know, they pick up that book and they're like, oh, they think like me. People do it now with BAP,
Sure.
you know. He thinks like me. He's the only one who understands me. Yeah.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And there's absolutely something to be said strategically, which is sort of what you're talking about. You need good ambassadors. You need to be able to play the game, because it is a game. And those who don't play the game, who sit in their marble cliffs, right? And hence the title of the book. Of course, he's not. Junger's character is not playing the game. Of course, he fights at the end, but then he leaves, right? He runs away. And that's not to say he shouldn't have ran away, but he opts out of the game. So it's something to be said of what is our role, because we like to consider ourselves.
Militant poet, I think, is a good way to put it. I think, like, militant poets should work together. You should have the poet side, and you should have the militant side, and then you should have the people that are both in the Venn diagram. And you should have the people that keep both sides working well with each other. If anybody gets like too militant and psychotic and hurts a poet, then get rid of them. If anybody is just like too much of a fag,
yeah,
you get rid
so
of them
you be able to
too.
take a punch still. I get you can paint really well, but come on,
Yeah, like you kind of have to demonstrate both. Not to say that if you're a poet, you can't like go perform a show, or that if you're like a hard brute that you can't go and kill the enemy. But just that you should keep the inner circle of the vanguard well gate kept. You have to if you want to avoid disaster. You have to understand how to keep a tight-knit group of people working together.
And that's what's so interesting, I think, about fascist Italy, is that people like Mussolini or Marinetti, D'Annunzio, they do sort of represent this mixture of the warrior and the poet. And of course, with my channel's name, The Warrior Philosopher, I created it when I was in the military. And, I did 5 years, I did my time, but I never saw combat. I'm not the ultimate ideal of the warrior like someone like Junger is, for instance. But I like to think of kind of like you said, the middle ground, bringing, because we need that hard power. We need the people in the NSA and the CIA who can do all the dirty work. And then we need things like the Fume that furnish the culture, because the culture war is just as important as the hard war, as we've seen today, because the hard war could be won by the right tomorrow. If there was a battle, civil war today, the right would win in 24 hours. But if people don't know they're fighting in the first place, it doesn't matter. And that's exactly what's happening.
That's a good point.
It's just as important. People need to realize that.
Yeah, so, and some people were only meant for the culture war, and some people were only meant for the martial war. Some people, their role is martial. That's it. They don't need to read poetry. They don't need to write poetry. Maybe they're protecting the poets on their side, but they are out there in the fields killing. That is what they should be doing. They should be defending their nation. They should be establishing their empire. And I think the poets benefit from that if they understand like a certain level of intellectual awareness that I think the true militant warrior poet kind of brings to the table. Something like Mishima, he brings this impulse to the table, and he inspires thousands to develop this new ethos.
Yeah, and of course, I'm the biggest Mishima fan you'll find. He's right here with me, actually. Actually, I am Mishima's reincarnation, so it's hard to say he's with me. He's in me.
I knew it. I could tell the minute I talked to you. I knew
exactly. It. Anyway, but Mishima, guys like Junger, Mishima, like you say, I think in large part, when we construct a state, even J.D. Vance is kind of the warrior poet in the sense. He did his little time in the military, right? So he's not the ultimate warrior, but he still he reads BAP, he reads the passive.
That's true.
They put out, so he's not exactly
a little bit. I mean, you don't know how much he's actually reading. I think a lot of that is overinflated. I think a lot of the online right likes to overestimate their influence that they have on the administration. As somebody who actually met Donald Trump at the inaugural ball, He has no idea about any of this stuff that's
Oh, I
going on the
agree.
internet.
He doesn't.
He
You like to
doesn't
think that some
know.
people
Yeah.
near him do, right?
So I think like is Vance following like some based accounts online? Sure, but is it Vance even running his account? I think the online right is just like way too. They overstate their soft political power in a way that's a little bit embarrassing. Um, yeah, okay. Did Bronze Age mindset make it to the White House? Sure. How much of it was actually read? How much of it was actually understood? We don't know. You know, I mean, a lot of it's mind games.
Sure.
I mean, I don't want to like undermine anybody, but I think we need to be realistic about like how much influence we actually have. I personally think it's better to just have an art gallery. I don't think I'm going to get any administrative power. I'm too weird and free thinking. I'd be killed, in the Night of the Long Nights, right? I'd be one of the casualties, right? So I just want to have my gallery and have a good time. Of course, I'd like it to last for more than a year. Fiume, the original one, lasted for a year. This is a generational project. It's a limitless space. We want everybody to come. So yeah, we're gonna have our warrior, poet, philosophers. We're gonna have, like our creative vanguards, and we're gonna have all of these elements. We're gonna have, new counter revolutionaries, the conservative revolutionaries. We're the conservative revolutionaries of our time. But we're also just gonna have cutting edge dancers. We're also just going to have esoteric fans, experimental noise artists. We're going to have multimedia installations where you can interact at exhibitions with different holographic projections. We're also going to have these dark burlesque shows where you engage with all sorts of interactive stimulations, kind of like Sleep No More, but a lot weirder and a lot cooler.
I'm not familiar with that.
It's theatrical, kind of like an escape room, but like a theatrical performance. You can go in. You can't tell the difference between the audience and the performers. They all interact with each other as part of the experience. It's called the live experience. So it's like immersive theater that you're inside of. Do you know The Theater and Its Double by Anton Artaud?
No.
He wrote The Theater of Cruelty. It was a manifesto about creating a new theater scene that was very vitalist in spirit. So kind of like a vitalist theater scene. And we want to do all that. We want it to be a surreal experience. I like the idea of bringing all sorts of people in, but having a private VIP room. I think that's a core aspect. You have the inner and the outer, so anybody can come and check out the art, like anybody can come and like see a band play, but you can also join as a member, become a part of the VIP coalition, hang out 24/7.
The Cult of Bacchus.
Only lounge. Yeah, and we have our most prized installations there, so you can become, essentially a founder of the gallery that way. You can become a founding member of Fume, join as a member, have 24-hour access to the VIP room. Like Soho House.
Yeah, I've never been to New York,
but yeah, it's like a members only club.
Yeah, sure.
It's like that for the dissident vanguard, the rising founder class. So yeah, like picture that, but like for the rising futurists, right?
No, I think that's a necessary space to have.
So you've got the private, and then you've got the public, and all of it kind of interacts. I want to be above board.
A hierarchy in the gallery.
Yeah, I want to be above board. I don't want to have to hide in the shadows. I don't want to have to like OPSEC my way into military intelligence. I just want to throw parties at my gallery, provide a VIP space for people to have good conversations and have beautiful art that blows people's minds. That's enough for me. For me, like the cultural power is a lot more important. That's my area of focus.
Yeah, well, you need factions within the tent of the overall zeitgeist, which is, in this case, dissident, right? You can't have it's sort of like you said with the distinction of the warrior poet, the poet. Not everyone can, obviously we can't all create art galleries. We also can't all be soldiers. We need that cohesion. We need that tent, because each part of this, the culture war, the real wars, big spiritual or whatever, they're all necessary. So I think it's, that's the good thing about having a general direction. And one of the reasons why I still appropriate the word right wing, because within that tent, you're able to have each person representing the larger zeitgeist. For example, you could do the art gallery. You don't have to run for office or whatever. You can focus on that niche, because if we have everybody trying to do the same thing, we're not going to get anywhere. So we need some specialization. We're Renaissance people, but also we have that specialization.
I think we might have had a little disagreement in the Twitter space where we thought it was important to like import people in to become the new administration, like from our faction. But I thought, okay, you could do that, but how much of the message is really going to get out there? Like, at what point do you just become the thing that you're infiltrating in a way where you've lost your original values? Like, why not just go off and form, well, like your own Fume? Like conceptually, why not just do your own thing? Kind of like stay in the cultural realm. You don't need to be a part of the state.
Yeah, I don't think everyone needs to. We need some representation, right? Like,
oh no, we do.
Yeah, it just doesn't have to be all of us. So I misrepresented myself. I guess what I was saying is that to have these projects, we need some, because like, for example, you couldn't have done the Fume at the height of wokeness, right? Like, that would have been like,
that's true.
Right?
I mean,
so it's like, yeah,
yes and no. I mean, the New Art Right came out in 2018, and it was originally published under the title "The New Reaction" on Artite Media. So I was very early, and I suffered. I was canceled for it, and I was doxxed. I went through all the things.
Right.
But it's true that it wasn't until Trump won the election that people started investing in my gallery. They were interested in the whole, like, oh, it's a right-wing art gallery. Well,
Right.
we want to be a part of this now. Where before Trump, they were cowardly about it. I mean, now they're like, oh, we're winning, so we can do this now because we're winning. So yes, it is important to have state power. But I don't think it's for everybody. I don't think that just because you're of a certain political alignment that you necessarily have to like take, the state, into your hands. There are different roles for everybody, like in this faction. I don't think that everybody should be, like encouraged to join the government. I think some people should, some people will, some people already have, and that's great. But I don't think it's for everybody.
Yeah, one of the missions of my channel is kind of representing both sides, because obviously I get a lot of military people who are either in the military or plan to join. But I also like to represent that's like warrior and philosophy, right? The philosophy encompasses the art, maybe tech, whatever, just everything. And then the warrior side's obviously the hard power, politics. All right. So I think, I completely agree with you. We can't, I would argue that to have state power, we need some people that just focus on the cultural side of it.
That's where the Marinetti and the Mussolini connection comes in.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say, like, first of all, like biology, right? Biological facts. I'm a woman. Obviously, I'm not going to fight in a war because I'm a woman. So I'm not going to go fight in a war. Okay, I can be like maybe a strategic war general. I can write the blueprints for how to go and attack in the field. It still just puts me in the category of writer. I'm a philosopher of power. I might get killed in my own regime, ad infinitum, right? So yeah. I think, like some people just aren't cut out for it. But we should have our people in there. Don't get me wrong about that. I just don't think it should be our only focus, because if we focus only on achieving militant power within the state, we're ignoring the cultural institutions that have rotted from the inside out. All of the cultural rot is a major, major issue. I mean, you can even see when Trump is talking about wanting to make America beautiful again. He wants to restore beauty to architecture. They have the Civil Arts Society. They want to restore classical architecture in America. So they're already on it, but they don't understand the complexities of it. They don't understand the history of art movements. They don't understand how things have gone in a creative spiritual way. They just are like, oh, things are ugly now. Now we should make them beautiful, right? But they don't really understand art history.
Right.
And I think that, like you do need people like on the cultural vanguard to come out and establish new institutions.
Yeah.
And if the government wants to, fund them, why not? Get a grant, by all means, have the state pay for your institution, go out there and do it. But if the state isn't supporting your institution, form it anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it needs to go even further than just personal projects, and eventually has to get into academia, because what people don't realize is the reason why the left can put out all these films and documentaries. So I'm a journalism major, but also means I get a lot of exposure to like
Ooh,
EMC,
I
which is like,
see. Okay.
yeah, like, so I see a lot of the documentary process as well. And they get so much money to make these
Yeah.
films, and they don't even make money. These films don't make money. Barely anyone watches them, but they pump in, like, they give you like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars,
Yeah.
right? And they produce slop. So imagine if we could even just get a fraction of that for us, right? So that part is important too,
Well,
because they get so much money, grants, right?
so okay, so the us versus them distinction, I get it, but I think there's a bit of a defeatist attitude that a lot of people in this community have. They just feel like they'll never get into the mainstream, and that kind of feeds this self-sabotage where people, they say things that are more extreme than they really believe because they've already been locked out of the system. Where meanwhile, the people that already have the power in the system, that already have all the funding for their films, they might have thoughts that are, like even more extreme than we do. But they just like keep them under wraps. They just keep quiet about them because they know that it's going to hurt their career. They're not content creators, so to speak.
Yeah,
So
that's the
they're
BAP
just
strategy,
really,
kind of.
yeah, really stealth about it. But I do see people that are funding independent films now that are deliberately going out of their way to have more vitalist filmmaking be in the spotlight. I see all kinds of creative organizations that are giving grants to creatives that are right wing. I've even gotten a bunch of like DMs like, hey, we're throwing a right wing film contest. You know anybody
Yeah.
that wants to submit a film to it? I mean, passage prize. So I think, like there is its own, little system that's growing. But don't have a defeatist attitude about it.
Right.
Like if you have to disguise your opinion for a minute, it doesn't mean that you don't have it. Like as an autistic, like if you need to disguise your view, it doesn't mean that you're not true to it. It just means you're being strategic.
No,
There's nothing
absolutely.
wrong with that. Yeah.
Yeah, destroy it from the inside. But no, I completely agree. And I guess more so what I'm saying is that there should, speaking of blackpilling, there shouldn't be a fight to allow the academic institutions to be dominated by the left, because that grant money that they get would
That's
be
true.
great
Okay,
if we had it.
this is a big one. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, really hard to disagree with that. I think that independent universities forming is definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
As silly as the IDW is, the University of Austin, it did like inspire a lot of independent academic institutions and counter academic. Um, Mulva called it the anti-diversity, I believe. So I think these things do exist. Even Justin Murphy, when he was doing Other Life, he was teaching classes on Nietzsche and Strauss. There are independent academic institutions that exist online. Um, you can go online and learn about Heidegger or Carl Schmitt now. You can do it. It's independent, but we're a nation of founders. So, I mean, the question is like, why die on the hill of taking back the institutions when you can create your own? I believe in the principle of exit over voice. I don't think that we have to, become the new academy. I think we can just start our own academies.
Yeah, I don't know. I just think for me, it's more so about resources. Like they just have so many resources that'd be so great to have. Like when I was looking up right-wing colleges, the closest you could get is like a BYU. I'm like, I'm not going to a BYU. Come on. But anyway,
Yeah.
could see me at
That's
a BYU.
fair. I guess it's just like a matter of like, do you really want to be a part of the herd? Is it worth it? Do you want to be like,
To lead the herd, right? It's like we got to
do
create
you
our
want to
own noble
be,
lives.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
in the
right.
guardian class. That's at least
That's
my
what we're
position,
doing. Hell yeah, no, I feel that really hard. I think we do need to have our on our DD unit, so to speak. We just need to know how to sort people properly, including ourselves. But I don't think that becoming the new academy is the way to go. I think that all the money that they're receiving is drying. It's drying up. You know, like you saw with the whole USAID thing.
Yeah, that's true.
You you know, like whatever you think about Trump and a lot of people that think he's not being effective enough right now. He did cut a lot of the spending on a lot of the institutions. I mean, they did get rid of a lot of the woke cultural institutions. I mean, even Christopher Rufo, even
Yeah.
he was on the ground getting rid of DEI. So,
I don't like
I
Rufo that
mean,
much, but he was doing good stuff initially.
nah, because he was telling everybody to work at Panda Express, and
Yeah, what the
he's on
fuck?
the wrong side of the H-1B debate.
Yeah.
But you know, credit where it's due. You know,
Yeah, he
they
did
did
some
get
good
rid
things.
of the one guy did good things. No, like if you're on the wrong side of the H-1B, just like fuck off. Thank you for your service. But yeah, no, no, I agree with you.
But Vivek, my sleepovers.
There's a little,
Why I can't go to
yeah,
sleepovers?
I know you're not invited to the Manhattan Institute anymore.
No.
You can't. This is I met a guy that worked at the Manhattan Institute the other night,
Hmm.
and he was saying stuff that would have gotten him fired if they knew what
Yeah,
he
sure.
was saying. I'm like, I couldn't believe it. But yeah, I think that we're doing better now than
Yeah,
we were a year ago. I think the institutions have definitely lost a lot of, their diversity hires, and
true.
their curriculum has definitely changed a bit. But I mean, is it really worth it to lower yourself just to like have that kind of grant money? I mean, isn't it better to just find new investors that want to give you money for doing something that's more in the vein of what you believe?
Yeah, I guess to sort of wrap that up, I guess my closing sort of reason for that would be part of the power of finding new investors is also how the university is funded. You think about how much federal funding they receive, how many private funding they receive from donors. All those things can be oriented in a way where they're forced to start redirecting that grant money, because the biggest problem with the dissident right today is that people can't do it full time. Most people, right, not everyone obviously, but most people can't create right-wing art permanently or right-wing content permanently because there's no avenue of funding for it. So that's my main thing for that. But yeah, that's sort of my thing. But I
No,
understand the point.
it's a realist outlook. I mean, you do have to look at the material conditions, and
Yeah.
you can do that outside of Marxism. You don't need to be a Marxist to look at the material conditions of things. So I think you're right. But I think a lot of people, they are creating new foundations.
Yeah, you're
Like
right.
if you
Well,
look
the
at the
Fume,
future,
there
people
we
are,
go.
yeah, okay, we're creating new foundations. And we have independent donors, that are looking to help grow this thing.
Yeah.
So for all we know, like in even a year's time, we could have cultural domination, which could lead to political domination. I just wouldn't overestimate our influence right now. I think that's the big mistake. Like understand, like we're doing independent things right now, and some things have changed. You know, but we're not at that point where we have like cultural power.
Hmm.
We're getting to that point. We're working toward it. It's very early. We're all very early. This is an early adoption.
Absolutely. We don't want to rush the Blitzkrieg too fast and run out of oil. We got to take the Baku fields first before we push to Moscow. But anyway,
Yeah.
on that note, obviously, a lot of cool things coming up with Fume. Just to sort of wrap it up, are there any last things you want to say about your project, or maybe go ahead and shill all you want? This is a free shilling zone
Okay,
for
I'm
these sort of things.
shilling. I'm allowed to shill now. Okay. So you can go to the website for my art gallery. It's Fiume.nyc, Fiume.nyc. You can check out my Substack blog. It's culturalfuturist.net. I host monthly salons. If you join as a member, you can attend them. We have poets, we have speakers, we have roundtable discussions, live performance art, and you can also join the Fume Gallery if you want to be a part of the Fume Gallery. You can go ahead and email us on our website. You can buy my book, The New Art Right. It's available on Amazon, and I have absolutely nothing else to shill.
That's a good list. I'll have Rachel send me the links. All the links will be below, and y'all should check that out, Legionaries, and be part of the not only the physical war, but also the cultural war, and by extension, the great spiritual war of our time of
Spiritual war.
the great ugliness, right?
So something Evola.
Yeah, there we go. Well, I like reading Evola, but I think he misdirects too many young frogs these days.
Reaction, the future. There's a lot of we can go on about this forever. I will leave this with progress has slowed us down. We're futurists. We're not progressives.
Absolutely.
We've been slowed down by progress. That would be my final note.
Absolutely. Well, I'm in agreement there. But Legionaries, be part of the great struggle that's upcoming. Prepare yourself intellectually, physically, and everywhere in between. But as always, well, thank you, Rachel, for joining the podcast. And this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the Warrior philosophy. And we'll see you all next time.